All right. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here, which is the first of a few seminars we'll have exploring the role of technology and warfare and society. We have a great pleasure to have Antoine Bousquet here. Unfortunately, his plane was severely delayed yesterday, so we couldn't do the seminar then, but here we are. Antoine is a reader at Birkbeck College in London. He has written several things on the topic we're discussing here. Among other things, his last book, which explored the role of science and technology in warfare, and the book that recently came out, which is called The Eye of War. We'll hear more about that later on. And if you have 200 crowners later on, you can also pick up the book when you leave. And with that, I'll give the word to Anton.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you for coming. As Eric says, I wasn't able to be here yesterday, so I apologize for that. But it's good to see you here. I want to thank NUPI and Eric in particular for inviting me and having me over. It's a great pleasure to be here. I should say also that we have a theory seminar that runs at 10:30 right after this lecture, in which we'll talk about various theoretical and methodological commitments to the study of war. So if any of you would like to participate in that, you're more than welcome. So what I want to talk to you today about is really the book I've been working on for a number of years. It just came out last month at the University of Minnesota Press, which concerns itself with the role of military perception in conflict and notably in relationship to processes of targeting. I mean, one of the things I think was a starting point for the book was to get a sense of how we got to a point where we can speak increasingly of global targeting, where what you can see in the battle space, you can ultimately destroy to a large extent. The strategist Martin Lewicki put it very pithily: visibility, he says, equals death. And this is a goal that very clearly advanced militaries are striving for. In 2004, the US Air Force articulated the view that its nuclear and conventional precision strikes can credibly threaten and effectively conduct global strike by holding any target on the planet at risk, and if necessary, disabling or destroying it promptly. So global strike is the model or the ideal towards which military targeting is now tending. So there's three kinds of main questions that have animated my research and the book. A first question is to ask how we got here. To produce, in answer to it, a history of our present moment. How did we get to this remarkable state of affairs? A second set of questions has to do with thinking through the implications for human warfighters as they become more and more embedded and integrated into technologies of perception. Finally, a third question arises, which is to think through what the consequences of this capability is for the landscapes of war and security in the 21st century. So what I want to propose to do today is to talk to you about what I've called the Marshall gaze, which is to say, to try and understand and unpack the functional constituents of what we might call, to follow the late Paul Virilio, the logistics of perception. There is a logistics at war, we all know that, but there's a key logistics of perception that plays an increasing role. And in doing so, I've tried to delineate 4 areas. The first 3 could be thought of as the active components of the logistics of perception: sensing, the gathering of perceptual information through various means; imaging, the representation of that perception through media; thirdly, mapping, the correlation of that sense perception and its representation through imaging in relationship to geospatiality, to the spatial reality that it is capturing, which of course is essential if you are going to then allocate force and direct it at the objects of perception. Finally, we have a component which, or an activity which isn't a primary component of the martial gaze or the logistics of perception, but covers all the counter responses to it, which I've called hiding. Think of camouflage, stealth, all the countermeasures taken in order to obstruct, misguide, mislead the martial gaze. And of course it's very significant not only because it gives us the response, the reactive aspect of war, but also these measures are themselves then the spur for further developments in the logistics of perception. So that new technologies, new techniques are developed in order to, in turn, counter those responses. So I'll talk through these today, but I think it's important to try then to see where our story starts. And it starts, I would argue, in the Renaissance. And in the book, I begin by considering the discovery of linear perspective, the art form or the art technique closely associated with the Renaissance and with Western art. What is significant beyond its artistic relevance is that linear perspective ultimately participates, initiates a conjoined rationalization of vision on the one hand and mathematization of space. Ultimately, linear perspective is a set of mathematical techniques for measurement by eye. So this is obviously related to the whole techniques of surveying and so on. How do you deduct distances on the basis of angles of sight and so on? Linear perspective further provides rule-governed construction of optically convincing images. That's the immediate property that we observe when we see a linear perspective image, is that it looks optically realistic. And this is not done in a haphazard way. It was done and is done by applying very systematically geometric rules. And finally, it provides the means for a geometric projection of a three-dimensional space onto a two-dimensional surface in a way, crucially, that preserves the relative proportions of that space. So already in linear perspective, you find some of the key constituents of what I call sensing, imaging, and mapping, all tied together through a common geometry. And in a way that abstracts vision from its corporeal embodiment, from what we would think as common phenomenological experience. This is why there's a very peculiar thing that happens within perspective, is that the human within perspective is both the subject of perspective. We're often told in histories of art and Western culture that perspective ties into a conception of the modern subject that replaces God as the center of our universe. So religious art didn't try to represent the world as it looked to us. It was supposed to represent it in its spiritual, numinous quality, whereas linear art, or linear perspective art, is designed to be seen from the eyes of a spectator. So in some ways, it could be seen as empowering the human subject. That's the most common narrative we're given about linear perspective. But at the same time, it produces the human as an object, because it objectifies, rationalizes, abstracts the capabilities of perception of the human in ways that will subsequently allow for them to be automated and autonomized. And this dynamic is something I think that then we should bear in mind as it carries through the rest of our story in important ways. So the first aspect I want to broach here is that of sensing. With sensing, obviously, we're looking at the ways in which we perceive objects in space, the different means through which that information is acquired. But I particularly want to think about its articulation with targeting. And to that end, I've suggested that there are 4 orders of targeting. These are orders that are successive. They've developed more or less successively, but without necessarily taking over each other, but in embedding them successively in one another. So the first of the orders of targeting is the most obvious one, which is aiming, where what you see is an alignment of the sight with the line of fire. This is typically what you see with a firearm. What you effectively, the firearm allows you to do is to align your line of vision, your line of sight, with the line of the firearm, approximately, more or less. But effectively, it's a weapon that in which you aim at a target, pull the trigger, and normally you hit it. This, of course, was eventually supplemented by telescopic magnification. As the range of the weapons increased, various telescopic aids allow for that alignment to carry over greater distances. And the telescope, of course, is a significant technology because it was a breakthrough in optical science, would lead to further developments, and it, of course, was one of the first mechanical, technological extensions of human perception. The telescope was first reports of the telescope anyway are to be found in 1608, when they were unveiled at the court of Maurice of Nassau in the Low Countries. And one of the people who witnessed this was Ambrogio Spinola, the commander of the Spanish forces of the Low Countries. And he was immediately impressed by what he saw and understood the military relevance of it. From now on, he says, I can no longer be safe, for you will see me from afar. And I think, in a sense, that's a very prescient comment, anticipating what the logistics of perception have made a fact today. Now, a second order is the order of ranging. And ranging really deals with the visual measurement of distances, or more broadly, the measurement of distances. And this, of course, becomes particularly significant in the context of targeting when you're dealing with targets that are quite remote, in which the line of fire is likely to be an indirect line of fire, or at least one in which the munition will have to take a parabolic trajectory. So, of course, this developed very soon alongside the techniques of gunnery, using surveying techniques of triangulation. Here you have an example of that technique of triangulation, where using effectively what to us today is fairly basic trigonometry. You've probably all done this at school, where effectively you know that if you know the length of one side of a triangle and you know two of the angles of that triangle, then you can compute very quickly the length of the other sides. So here effectively you have a base shaped by 2 points of sighting. You can measure the angles, and then you just apply the math and you can work out how far the object sighted is. Very relevant, very useful information when you're trying to aim artillery. And again, various devices come into play to assist in this. Here is an optical rangefinder from the First World War, an ingenious device which effectively produces the same activity, or delivers the same task. This elongated tube has sights at both sides, mirrors, a system of mirrors that brings the image into a single visor, in which the officer, the agent of this surveying process, aligns the images of various mechanisms and then can just read on top of or off the device the distance to the object sighted. The third order is the order of tracking. Now, tracking is, of course, a problem that arises when you try to target mobile objects. When these objects are moving at sufficient speed, then actually you need to start anticipating where they are going to be in order to target them, so that you can aim a munition at a point in space-time as opposed to simply in space. And the principle of tracking is really to use the continuous following of a target to record the history of its movements in order to produce a prediction about its future position. This is techniques that developed in the late 19th century in the context of naval warfare, further accelerated in the mid-20th century with what was referred to as the anti-aircraft problem, because aircraft move a lot faster, of course, than boats, and therefore the challenge is much greater in terms of predicting their future position. And this was one of the drivers of early computing devices and electrical gun directors of this nature. So we start seeing then as increasingly sophisticated targeting assemblages, combining machines and human operators. Here we have a director tower from on a Royal Naval battleship. It's designed to provide targeting information for an anti-aircraft control system. And here we see this sophisticated assemblage, a crew of a control officer, a layer, a trainer, and a range taker. The range taker you may not have observed is right here. His head is embedded, so to speak, in the rangefinder. Now, significant advances were made in the techniques of tracking throughout the Second World War, but ultimately this so-called anti-aircraft problem could not be solved. In other words, the challenge of predicting the future position of aircraft was too great, particularly when aircraft started flying higher and faster. This was already a problem in the Second World War. The introduction of jet engines meant that it was a foregone conclusion that you would not be able to solve the anti-aircraft problem on the basis of tracking alone, or at least as it existed. Hence, the fourth order of targeting, guiding. What guiding does ultimately is relocate the targeting process into the projectile itself in order to track it continuously, ultimately to the very point of impact. Now here we have an early guidance system, the brainchild of the famous behaviorist B.F. Skinner. This was Skinner's wartime work in the Second World War. Skinner, who of course was very fond of pigeons, came up with the idea that if you condition pigeons, teaching them to peck at a target, they're being conditioned on the bottom right, then you would be able to produce a guidance system in which pigeons would peck at a screen towards a target that they've been trained to recognize, and here would be a Navy ship, and this would adjust the guidance steering control of the missile in order to reach its target. This system ultimately never came to fruition. More likely, well, certainly according to Skinner, because he found it quite hard to sell to the military, who thought it was a bit of a crackpot idea. But there's indications that it would have worked. In fact, the US Navy continued to fund it after the Second World War. And perhaps the greater reason for its failure to ever come to the battlefield is simply that other technologies quickly came about that made it very impractical. So for instance, radar technologies and so on were found to be much more effective guidance technologies than your friendly pigeon. And so, from a pigeon to a penguin. Does anyone in this room recognize this? This is, as some of you seem to recognize, is a Penguin anti-ship cruise missile, Mark II, engineered and produced in Norway, right here. And this is just one example of a contemporary guidance system, equipped with this one infrared terminal homing. These missiles often will therefore make use of other techniques of the order of targeting. There's still aiming involved, there's still ranging and tracking going on, but all of this is embedded in a single system and that we can find in various articulations in contemporary weapon systems. And indeed, while the narrative I've been telling you about was mainly focused around vision, so perception in the visible spectrum that as humans we are sensitive to, what we've obviously seen, particularly since the mid-20th century, is an extension of perception across the electromagnetic spectrum, from visible light into infrared, radar, even ultraviolet. Ultimately, potentially any part of that spectrum can be of some military relevance or another. Infrared in particular, of course, has had great military significance. for the purposes of heat-seeking weapons, for instance, the Penguin missile that we just saw, but also, of course, for the techniques of night vision, which play a crucial role in contemporary military force. The ability for militaries to operate by the cover of darkness is a very significant advantage. Radar, of course, is an equally ubiquitous technology without which contemporary warfare would be unimaginable. There's also parallel developments in the field of sound, which obviously is not part of the electromagnetic spectrum. Most significantly today in sonar, where since underwater these other techniques or these other electromagnetic fields are not particularly perceptible. And I treat these in the book, but ultimately the same principles of the orders of targeting apply here. One final word with regard to sensing, and a final technological development, perhaps a very significant one, is the development of laser. Effectively, the concentration of beams of photons that produce systems which are capable of fulfilling, once again, the four orders of targeting. You can use lasers for aiming, for ranging, for tracking, and for guiding. But in addition, of course, the laser also promises the emergence of a directed energy weapon, tantamount to a weaponization of light itself. This is a development that is still ongoing. Powerful laser systems are still not active on the battlefield, but many efforts and considerable expenditure is being made in order to achieve this. This is the airborne laser, eventually cancelled project, but which the US military spent billions on in developing. And of course you can see the appeal of it because in many ways it appears like the completion of this development or alignment of perception and targeting, in which light itself becomes the weapon system, and one that is almost instantaneous since it travels at the speed of light. Let's move to imaging, the recording and the circulation of visual perception. And this story, of course, starts with the invention of the camera eye in the 1830s, through a technology that allows the chemical capture of focused light that automates the production of images. And in some ways, one of the ways of understanding the history of photography was as the outcome of a concerted effort to produce machines, mechanisms that could produce these perspectival images that were first developed in the Renaissance. How to make that production of perspectival images automatic. Now, it's probably not until the early 20th century that photography becomes, strictly speaking, or at least to a large extent, a military technology. And this, of course, comes with the First World War and the development of aerial photography. So it's ultimately in combination with the aircraft, with the elevation into the airs, that photography comes into widespread military use. And of course, it's particularly relevant to the First World War because of the nature of that conflict. Certainly on the Western Front, dominated by trench warfare, static fronts, in which continuous mapping was required, and in which artillery fire played a crucial role. So therefore, the aircraft and the camera provided an unparalleled way of obtaining up-to-date information on the state of the battlefield, on the position of enemy forces, all of which could feed in to the targeting process. This use of aerial photography, of course, developed only further in the Second World War, where it was an instrumental part of the strategies of strategic bombing, where both Allies and Axis powers attempted to bomb their opponents into submission, and in order to do so, gathered intelligence that allowed them to pinpoint, or at least attempt to pinpoint, those strikes against what they thought were the key nodes of the economies and the military machine of those states. After the Second World War, of course, the camera eye goes orbital. It is sent into space and affixed to satellites. And here again, the role of satellite imaging in the Cold War is key. We think of the Cold War as being dominated by nuclear deterrence, then we have to understand it, of course, nuclear deterrence was premised on maintaining a balance of forces. It will ultimately became referred to as mutually assured destruction. And the ability to gather information of this nature to gain an assessment of the capabilities of an adversarial state without having to infringe their airspace, which could be, of course, a cause of war. The satellites, in many ways, satellite photography in particular, was a stabilizing factor, certainly a key element of the nuclear balance of terror. This is a period, of course, also where we see the advent of what's referred to as remote sensing, which is to say imaging moves from beyond the visible spectrum across the electromagnetic spectrum. So imaging from satellites increasingly produced by infrared imagery, radar imagery, LiDAR imagery. And this is really part of a wider transformation in some ways of the image that takes place in the second half of the 20th century. What we might speak of as the digitization of the image. And digitization is very significant because it means that the image really fundamentally changes in its material ontology. Earlier, photography was, as I said, a chemical capture of focused light. Ultimately, digital imaging is captured as statistical data points from which images are then generated. This has two important ramifications. Oops. One is the development of autonomous vision machines. So because the digital image is ultimately just information, you can then process that information in a quite effective way through algorithms designed to extract numerical or symbolic information from those images. So, of course, we are in an age where computer vision is advancing by leaps and bounds, where it is able to make discriminations about what are in those pictures, and on that basis to make certain decisions, for instance, targeting decisions. But there's a second ramification of the digitalization of imaging, which is the creation of synthetic visual environments. Increasingly, military operators are immersed in these synthetic realities. Think of the various techniques of augmented and virtual reality. Here's a fairly common application. It's called a synthetic vision display. You find these in many aircraft, civilian and military today, in which overlaying the view out of the cockpit, or maybe on a standalone screen, you have the generation of a virtual representation of the environment as it would be if you were just looking out of the cockpit, as you are, in fact. And of course, the purpose of this is to help pilots navigate in poor weather, but also potentially to overlay critical information on it. So increasingly, military operatives are engaging with their environment through the lens of these synthetic virtual environments, which are in a key fashion geolocated or synchronized to the geolocation in which they find themselves. Let's move to mapping. So with mapping, of course, we're dealing with the representation of physical space and the location of entities within it. Again, a key development in the story that I'm telling here is the development of, or emergence of, scientific mapping in the early modern period, the Mercator Projection, of course, being the most famous of those maps. This was closely tied to an era of colonial expansion, of course, so maps took on significant military and strategic importance. And these were maps that were attempted to capture physical space in a rigorous way, in applying mathematical formulas in order to do so, and always with very practical intentions. So the Mercator Map, another one here, the Mercator Map, of course, has been criticized at different times for its alleged misrepresentation of the shapes of continents and so on. And of course, whatever representation you choose, when you try to apply or flatten a globe into a two-dimensional surface, you will get some forms of distortions or others. But what's important to remember about the Mercator Map is that the original choice of the projection of the Mercator Map was so that navigators could trace straight lines on the map. So it was designed as a navigational map. It was designed so that it would automate or simplify the calculations that navigators would make. And so when you think about maps, and particularly military maps, we should also think about these as cognitive aids, as representations of space that are designed to participate, assist in the calculations necessary for the navigation or targeting of objects in space. Once again, the First World War marks a turning point in military mapping. Until then, maps had limited tactical importance. It had strategic, maybe operational importance, but at a tactical level, not so much. This changes in the First World War, again, partly because of the static front that meant that very relatively tight areas were heavily contested, but also because of the development of indirect artillery fire. Throughout the conflict, all the belligerents involved in a massive cartographic production, again, partly assisted through aerial photography, but also surveying on the ground. It's estimated that the Germans produced a new image of the Western Front, of the entire Western Front, every 2 weeks. So unprecedented, intense surveying of the battlefield, or of anywhere, in fact, for that matter. One of the important developments as well in the maps is the development of gridding. So maps overlaid with grids that provide coordinates for the purpose of operations and, of course, for the purposes of targeting. Because maps were fed in directly into the process of targeting, so much so that one of the techniques that developed at the time was so-called map shooting, in which surveyors or troops in the ground would sight enemy forces, translate these into grid coordinates, feed the grid coordinates to the artillery, and the artillery would know how to lay the gun in order to strike that point on the map. This gridding of the battle space continued apace thereafter, throughout the Second World War, and in a sort of culmination in the universal transverse Mercator Projection of 1947, a two-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system for the location of any point on the globe down to a single square. The UTM, as it's called, underpins today the so-called military grid reference system used by all NATO forces. And versions of this are also common in civilian applications, such as, for instance, GPS. So towards the mid-20th century, because one of the things that had to be done is this grid had then to be applied on the globe, and that meant acquiring a very precise understanding of the shape of the globe, because the globe is not a smooth surface. It is not, in fact, a perfect globe. It's kind of fatter at the center of it. And so huge geodesic efforts had to be devised, funded in large extent by the US military, in order to produce a gridding system that would apply across the globe, and of course could feed into targeting, particularly at the time, the prospect of the targeting of nuclear missiles. I've talked about or mentioned GPS, and of course GPS technologies is a crucial enabling technology today. GPS relies on a network of satellites orbiting the Earth and sending radio signals to receivers on the ground, but of course it also relies on the military grid reference system in order to associate the location provided by the GPS with a grid referent. Otherwise, you wouldn't really know where you would be in relation to the wider space. So GPS, of course, has become essential to contemporary military operations and to the precise guidance of weapon systems. So many different weapon systems are GPS guided. Just as in imaging, computerization has transformed mapping. And one way of thinking of that is through the advent of the Geographic Information System, where effectively maps are no longer what they used to be. Right? The conventional map was a static visual representation, at least punctuated. You can update it, but ultimately it's what it is. geographic information systems means that maps are really now only a visual representation, a fluctuating visual representation, a dynamic representation of repositories of geospatial data. These repositories of data can themselves be continuously updated through various data feeds, calculative operations. And the map user is in a very different relationship to GIS or to Geographic Information System than to the old map. Yes, the map is a cognitive aid, and you can draw on it, and you can make various calculations on the basis of it. But today, the GIS operator is able to select the data that he or she needs to be represented on the display, can ask the system to produce calculations, to draw correlations. So we have a much more dynamic interfacing of minds with mapping systems today. And this is manifest in the military context through such initiatives as the Command Post of the Future, something that the US Department of Defense has been experimenting with for, well, a couple of decades now, and was deployed significantly in Afghanistan and Iraq. And again, this impacts military operations in important ways. One of the ways it does is that the battle space that's represented through these systems never resolves into a single definite picture. It is rather constantly updated, fluid, and always in the process of construction. So what has happened with the transformation of the map into the Geographic Information System is that the map is now explicitly tasked with being simultaneously a visual representational form, a communication channel, a way by which various operatives communicate with one another, and a cognitive enabler. And increasingly, all these functions have to be developed in so as to be tailored to human capabilities and limitations. So the science of geography, or cartography at any rate, is increasingly also the study of human cognition, how to best represent information visually and how to dynamically interact with the user. So now we can move to the last aspect of the logistics of perception, which are the whole realm of countermeasures taken in order to block, to obstruct the operation of the martial gaze. Because as visibility becomes increasingly synonymous with a lethal vulnerability, efforts at concealment, diversion, and deception correspondingly redouble. One of the things we see early on in the 20th century, on the eve of the First World War, is a shift away from the bright, conspicuous colors of the past. So you think about 19th century or 18th century warfare, and soldiers wore very bright uniforms. These had both symbolic and functional value. In noisy, smoky battlefields, it would be quite helpful to be able to identify your own forces. But as visibility becomes vulnerability, as the ranges at which you can be targeted increase, the incentive becomes to reduce visibility. And so a quite drastic move away from bright color to earthy colors and muted colors becomes very marked. These uniforms, of course, would have been further developed in the sense that the techniques of concealment have been further developed to move away from monochrome muted colors to much more sophisticated disruptive patterns. Effectively, this corresponds to the technical development of camouflage in the 20th century. So for instance, devising on the basis very often of the study of natural camouflage in the animal world, making the use of markings or color contrasts to break up the form of the body and to hinder its recognition. Again, also based on a study of human cognition and perception, and what are the visual cues that our systems rely on to identify forms, to see, to distinguish figure from ground. All of this being countered by increasingly sophisticated techniques. Camouflage, of course, also applies to vehicles. And here we have one example of a very peculiar form of camouflage, which I think is instructive nonetheless, so-called Dazzle Camouflage, that was developed in the First World War. This is actually from a later application in the Second World War. What's interesting about Dazzle Camouflage is that early attempts to conceal ships using conventional camouflage, so let's try and paint ships sea-colored or sky-colored, just didn't work. You just can't conceal ships in this way. So the technique that was developed was one that would not conceal the ship. In many ways, it makes the ship more visible, but purposefully disrupt the shape of the ship so as to confuse particularly submarine operators about what was the front and the rear of the ship and what direction and what speed the ship was moving. And all information that was invaluable for the targeting of torpedoes. American and British ships used this extensively in the First World War. And although it disappeared with the advent of radar and other means of perception, Dazzle nonetheless is an interesting insight into some of the logics of concealment, where sometimes it's not about explicitly hiding, but about interrupting, jamming, disrupting the targeting or visual processes involved in targeting. Moving on, we can talk about other techniques, such as screening, the use of materials such as screens, nets, and so on, to just block the vision or the perception of the adversary. This, of course, in some ways may draw attention to something. So, for instance, the enemy would realize that this is obviously a road of military significance, but nonetheless, you're able to conceal movements along that road in a way that has some strategic value. As the means of perception moved from beyond the visual field of visible light to the electromagnetic field, so camouflage techniques have evolved as well, notably through the development of stealth. So stealth technology really is nothing else than the camouflage's response to the development of perception in the electromagnetic spectrum. This is an anechoic chamber used for measuring and therefore improving or minimizing the radar cross signal of an aircraft. Here's an F-117. And so, of course, much expenditure is now dedicated to reducing the radar visibility of key military assets. Finally, there's a technique which we might refer to as decoying, which actually operates as in the reverse to camouflage, in the sense that it deliberately draws the attention of the logistics of perception, of the martial gaze, but it draws it to what are effectively deceitful targets, such as a cardboard tank, or effectively drawing the attention of the gaze towards fake targets, either to conceal the visibility of real targets or to force the enemy to reveal themselves by their expenditure of their weaponry against it. Decoying is a very important aspect of contemporary warfare as well, of course embodied in flares and chaff, other ways by which you try to confuse, obscure, overwhelm military means of perception. So what we see today is a raft of technical responses that are faced, of course, with an ever greater sensitivity and reach of military perception. Each of these innovations comes in, then new means of perception are developed, or new techniques are developed in order to counter them in turn. And this, of course, has given rise to a kind of arms race, and one that has made the cost of imperceptibility, the countering of perception, increasingly costly, certainly in technical terms. So if you think about one of the most sophisticated stealth vehicles today, the B-2 bomber, you're dealing with a weapon system that costs roughly $2 billion a piece, which is why the US has only ever constructed 21 of them. That's a very impractical, it's a very heavy price bill to pay for. Few governments could. Even the US finds that quite eye-watering, and its successive aircraft would probably be just as expensive. So some would argue that there is a cost advantage to the means of perception, that ultimately the development of sensor techniques is going to be considerably cheaper than the means to foil them. And I think that is certainly a valid claim. But what we also are seeing is a more fundamental and radical set of responses that are not primarily technical ones. They're strategies of generalized concealment, dispersion, and expendability. And these are ones that we're increasingly seeing in the contemporary battle space. These come in various shapes and sizes. The first of these is the shifting of the arena of conflict to physical terrains in which the logistics of perception and its correlated processes of targeting are significantly hampered. So think of the ways in which advanced military techniques of perception struggle in certain environments, such as jungles, forests, and mountains. And so it's long been a strategy of weaker sides to use these environments to conceal themselves and to negate some of the advantages of contemporary weapon systems. Fighting in a desert, as the Iraqi army found out in 2001, is not very effective against an advanced military that has all the capabilities, perceptual capabilities we've been talking about. If you move to the mountains of Afghanistan or the jungles of Vietnam, then you've got much more of a fighting chance. One of the domains, or one of the areas in which this shift is happening now, is the city, the urban environment, which is becoming the site, of course, of the urban guerrilla. With the urbanization of the world, we're likely to see that as one of the terrains, again, where weaker opponents will want to shift operations in order to use the natural concealment, the natural clutter of the environment. A final means is the underground. If you move underground, you also are able to conceal yourself and protect yourself from targeting. We know the Viet Cong made extensive use of tunnel complex, even building them under American bases undiscovered for years. And throughout the world, we're seeing military installations burrowing into the ground to escape scrutiny and also potential targeting. A second response is characterized by the adoption of principles of dispersion and expendability, what we might refer to by the term of swarming. So this is something that's been theorized extensively by the US military, that increasingly we're in an age where military operations have to be conducted in a dispersed fashion. You no longer want to concentrate forces in particular positions. Of course, if you do that, you create higher visibility, greater vulnerability to targeting. And through modern communication means, the assumption is you can synchronize units in this fashion, pulsing towards an enemy target briefly and dispersing very quickly again. This literature on swarming first emerged in the 1990s, but it's had a new lease of life, of course, in the latest age of robotics, where speculations are involved in thinking about using multiple small drones or robots that could operate in this swarming fashion. One report right here, that was produced by a former Department of Defense head, speculated that the future of war might involve billions, I say billions, of insect-like drones swarming on their enemy. And of course, if you've got billions of targets, well, it's going to be very difficult for any weapon system to destroy them. But it would be a mistake to see swarming as something that only high-tech advanced militaries are doing. In fact, non-state actors have adopted swarming techniques already. You want to see early examples of it in the contemporary urban context. Think of Mumbai in 2008 or Paris in 2015, where state operatives, police forces, the military found out it's very difficult to manage situations where small units are dispersed in the city and employing force in a military mode. We might also, under this umbrella, think about the suicide bomber who effectively makes expendability into a strategic asset by covertly weaponizing the body. If someone is carrying explosives and willing to detonate them on their body, it becomes quite hard to detect them. And this, I think, nods to a final strategy of generalized concealment, what the philosopher Reza Negarestani refers to as hypercamouflage. By hypercamouflage, Negarestani refers to a silent and fluid military infiltration of civil society by antagonists who endeavor to veil their intentions until the very moment of assault. Negarestani postulates that this participates in a process of endo-militarization of peace that dissolves any notion of the battlefield as a delineated space, collapsing the respective categories of war and peace and the spheres of the military and the civilian. So hypercamouflage is effectively an adoption of a strategy that completely abolishes the distinction, the conventional distinction between the sphere of war and the sphere of peace. One of its consequences, Negarestani further submits, is that it places the entire citizenry of states under ever greater suspicion and produces a form of retro-militarization in which the teeth of the military flow back down its tail. And I think we can think of this strategy of, we might think of it as a strategy of radical concealment and correlate this with the strategy of, or the practice of global targeting with which I started. Global targeting as it's manifested today might be seen, for instance, in the US policy of targeted killings, in which targets can not only be targeted more or less anywhere in the world, but it can also be targeted on the basis of an individual basis. And this global targeting and the individualization of targeting that comes with it also participates in a corrosion of the conventionally bounded framework of war. Individualization of targeting premises that the legitimate, that the target is no longer defined by being in a space of war. You no longer target an individual or a unit because it is in a war space. The presence of the target defines the war space. A war space that might open up for just a moment, an instant, the instant of targeting, but is defined by the presence of the target, not the predefined space of war. So effectively inverting the customary precedence of the former. Some have suggested that this use of armed force is more akin to the model of the hunt than the model of the war. And if it is the hunt, then we shouldn't be surprised that the hunted is compelled to adopt ever more radical forms of concealment. So the radical form of concealment and global targeting seem to be logical correlates of one another. And what the sobering thought we might want to consider, and I'll leave you with, is that if the terrain of the hunt increasingly encompasses the globe and every nook within it, so we should also increasingly expect the logistics of perception, the martial gaze, to turn itself upon the very societies that gave rise to it. If the conventional battle space has disappeared, then potentially it emerges and re-emerges anywhere. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antoine. That was a great talk. I have a lot of questions myself, but I think that we should open it up to the floor and see if there's any comments, reactions, or questions. Anything? Yeah, Jens?
One thing you didn't mention here, but I suppose you have written about it, is that the way to conceal now is to interfere with these radiomagnetic things that you use to target. So that must be the way of hiding, I suppose. That's one question. The other one is that why should you think the military way when the targets are only individuals? Yeah.
Could you just specify the last question?
The last question is, you mentioned that military people now are thinking that you don't have any kind of, you don't necessarily have any kind of battle lines or anything like that. But if you only have individuals, individuals are not in itself a danger for your control of the space that the government has to do. So then why should they then think about these individuals as some kind of things that you had to wipe out in a military way?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Should I? Yeah. I mean, on your first point, very briefly, yes, absolutely, you're right. Of course, there are countermeasures that operate in the electromagnetic spectrum. I mean, chaff, for instance, is a way of jamming radar. Lasers can be used to blind infrared systems. So every development in the perceptual field brings with it countermeasures. That's clear. Your second point, I mean, I take it. Well, to reformulate what I'm trying to get at here is my sense is that talking schematically, but I think in ways that broadly are correct or applied, the kind of Westphalian state model is premised on an inside and an outside, on a domestic sphere that is the domain of the state, and in which force is used through the lens of policing primarily, and quite low level, which is quite a low level use of force, relatively speaking, and often takes as object very often individuals who are then deemed to be criminal. In contrast, you have projections of force externally, which are deemed to be collective, political, and in which, for instance, you target enemies because they wear uniforms. Your enemy is not a criminal; he's just a member of an armed force, and on that basis, you can target them. In fact, the laws of war specify that you can't target individuals if they're not wearing uniforms, and if they're not wearing uniforms, they're not legitimate combatants. What strikes me with the uses of force increasingly is that distinction is now increasingly eroding. We have belligerents who are not who are not bearing uniforms. One thing to say about the uniform is a social convention. If you think purely in terms of the strategic purpose of concealment, then uniforms, why wear uniforms? They reveal yourself to be. In fact, uniforms are paradoxical because on the one hand, yes, they conceal. Uniforms have camouflage, but they must also clearly identify you as a soldier. The best uniform would be concealing yourself as a civilian. So it's only by a convention of war that we prohibit that kind of behavior. Increasingly, there are combatants that don't play by those rules. And we have projections of force which treat the enemy certainly not as a legitimate combatant, sometimes as a criminal, explicitly, metaphorically, or even sometimes literally, and that on that basis increasingly pursues an individualized form of targeting. Now, you might say, why use the military means? Well, I think that has to do with the fact that we have a blurring between the domestic and the international spheres in this respect, where military forces now increasingly use techniques that are more akin to policing, and policing also blurs into the military domain. So I think what you're talking about in a way is the symptom of a deeper cause. The cause is not the individual per se, but a manifestation of a rebalancing or re-articulation of organized violence that no longer follows this binary between the domestic and the international, the policing and the military.
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My name is Karen Aneigen. I'm from the Norwegian Atlantic Committee. And as you were speaking, it's interesting how, as humans, we develop all of these kinds of technologies. And I guess my question is if you could say something more about the human or the relationship between humans and technology. Are we potentially going to end up in a war where humans don't fight artificial intelligence, all of that, like the human aspect of the development of these type of technologies? Thank you.
That's a very good question. So there's a lot of talk at the moment about artificial intelligence, about autonomous weapon systems, killer robots, or whatever, choose your phrase. My feeling about this is that in some ways the debate is important, but I think also misses some important aspects of this question. The debate seems to be premised on the idea that what we want to stay away is the development of an autonomous weapon system, something, an AI that would wage war without us. Now, I think that often overstates or understates, but rather the challenges required in order to produce anything like that kind of AI that would do this. But more significantly, I think that it's premised on the idea. So the advocates of controlling this technology say what we need is to maintain human control. Well, I think this idea of human control is hugely problematic, particularly through the account that I've presented to you, because in my mind, for going back perhaps to the Renaissance, but particularly since the last 100 or 50 years, humans have been human operatives on the battlefield, increasingly embedded with their technologies. And rather than I think that rather than crossing a threshold in which we're going to find, oh, well, machines are now completely taken over, before we even ever get there, we are going to get to a point where, or if we're not already there, a point where it's becoming increasingly difficult to know where the agency lies, because it's so distributed in the system, partly through human operatives, partly through the machines. I don't see huge appetite within the military for removing humans completely from the war system, but on the other hand, you could easily get to points where human operatives are making decisions where they're largely guided by the machines anyway. And you can say, well, the human that took the decision, legally they're responsible, morally they're responsible, whatever. But effectively, they've largely been guided and oriented by the machines. I think we need to think. This doesn't help us answer these difficult questions, I think, because I think it does suggest this is a much more challenging problem than we think it is, because we have to deal with the fact that human autonomy is probably a myth. You know, it's always embedded in the material world, and particularly with the kinds of machines that we have now, in ways that are much more distributed than we've ever seen.
You mentioned some of what I was thinking about, the artificial intelligence. So maybe you could say something about legal aspects. You know, for an operation, legitimacy is almost like an operational factor these days. Is this being discussed? Is the legal aspects following the technological development in this area? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, the legal question is not really an expertise of mine, but what I could say is it's clear that one of the problems around debates on autonomous weapons is the legal question. Is for instance, well, if a weapon, an autonomous weapon, targets a civilian or commits a war crime, who is responsible? Is it the manufacturer of the machine? Is it the programmer of the code? Is it the military who sent it out? Is it the last human person who gave it an order? And it's clearly a very thorny question. Our legal systems are not, or is it the machine itself? Our systems are not equipped for that. But that's why I suspect militaries will want to keep someone in the loop, if only for that, so that there will effectively be a human with a legal responsibility. So this is why I think we're not so likely to pass the threshold of autonomous weapon systems anytime soon, but that we're going to be in this much more complex space in which agency is redistributed, and while it may be legally convenient for us to say, well, obviously the human took the decision, my concern would be that this is effectively largely going to become a legal fiction that doesn't really account for the fact that the decisions that the human made were based on a whole raft of other systems that directed that agent towards that decision. So I think that poses huge problems for our legal system, because our legal system is entirely premised on autonomous humans, that you can hold people to account for decisions that they made. Well, I think that agency is going to be harder and harder to detect or to identify in the military systems of the future.
More questions? Yes.
I'm coming here not as a military expert or as a scientist in state, but as a person from outside. But I am an economist, and I read economic history, which is very often very close to military history, in fact. Because of that, one might have quite a lot of questions. One question which arises from my formation as an economist is the kind of warfare you are describing as a possibility here. Is that a small-scale warfare or a large-scale warfare? In fact, or might you have quite another way of thinking warfare? Quite a lot of small warfare is going on, so that the defender doesn't know where might what and what sort of warfare might come next. Beside all that, another question, which is because of Norwegian military history, the way Norway has been invaded or tried to invade Norway, and 2 words does describe that. Norway the attempt to capture Norway has been led by 2 words: by threat or by surprise. Those have been the 2 ways of capturing Norway. And those 2 ways were in fact combined in the German invasion of Norway in 1940. We had a diplomatic threat at the same time, in fact. Looking at the Norwegian military history, well, I'm speaking a little bit more than I had intended. But looking at the Norwegian military history, the way of conquering Norway was always by capturing, in fact, mostly from the southwest, and taking the fortifications in Fredrikshald. And those attempts were always figured out either by threat or by surprise. But there might be one possible exception to it. And that exception might have been in 1814, when the eminent French military, Jean-Baptiste Bernadotte, in fact already halfway was king of Norway. It was an overwhelming force he entered to come up with. You wouldn't believe it, but it was 50,000 soldiers which came to that small town to capture it. There were smaller battles around all the time, which has been overlooked, but there are quite a lot of small battles and skirmishes and so on. But no attack on the fortifications, because naturally.
You have a question for this, or is it?
Yes. A question. I started with the question, and now I'm filling in.
Okay, but then I think
but I said small scale, large scale, and what I ended up was that to take a small country had a large scale operation.
Thank you. I think it might be difficult for you to answer the specific Norwegian question.
Well, I bow to the gentleman's knowledge of Norwegian history. I cannot compete. But I'll say something about the broader question about large scale and small scale. So a lot of the history that we've been looking at, certainly up to the end of the 20th century, has been dominated by large-scale interstate war. That's been the engine for the development of warfare for the past few centuries. I don't want to make too many bold predictions about the future. That's hazardous. But we do seem to be in a time where large-scale interstate war is considered less probable. And partly, to maybe a large extent, because total war would mean nuclear war, which most states don't really want to engage in. And so interstate war, statistically, is now almost a non-occurrence. It's very rare. That's not to say it cannot happen again. And of course, if it did, our concerns about other less intense forms of warfare would probably appear more trivial. But as it is, I think what we're seeing is, rather than these conventional conflicts, which were much more clearly defined as having a beginning and an end, bracketed in a certain way, you move from a sphere of peace to a sphere of total military commitment, and then beyond it, we seem to be in a space where conflict and violence and what we might call war is a much more diffused condition in the globe, one that is not geographically or temporally continuous, but erupts in punctuated fashions at different moments and different times. When the Obama administration came in 2008, it made, I thought, was a very revealing move when it wanted to say the war on terror is over, or at least we're not going to call it the war on terror anymore. What we're going to call it, or what we're doing, we're going to call overseas contingency operations. I think that was a brilliant word, because this captures perfectly what the military condition of our age. It's contingent, which means it could happen at any point, any time, and it's completely open-ended ultimately. Right? It's not. People criticize the war on terror for having no kind of endpoint, but at least it was framed as a war, which presumably leads to some conclusion. But contingency operations is an indefinite condition, and that's pretty much where we are. This term has not been picked up by the contemporary administration. They don't talk about the war on terror even. We don't even know what to call it anymore. It's just receded now into the background of our existences, which is that around the world, the US and its allies will punctually project force, often against particular individuals that have been identified as being threatening to them. So we are dealing with that condition. That's the world we are in right now. And I think that participates in maybe you could fit that into a wider context of globalization, where states are no longer, while very important actors, no longer completely structure the international system in the way that they did, and interstate conflict is now a rarity, if still a possibility. I think next to you there was, but did you have a question? Did you? No?
Patrick?
You had a question. Oh, okay.
Going listening to you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for that talk. Really interesting. I was when I was listening to you talking about deception at the end and hiding. I was wondering. I mean, maybe this is like outside of the scope of your entire research project, but one of the things that I was thinking as you started discussing, the implications of hiding for the to see is to be able to destroy type of thing, right? And then this is where we're coming. In practice, we're also watching warfare other modes of hiding, and it's not hiding through deception. It's hiding through I'm standing in front of a 5-year-old kid, I'm shooting out of a hospital, whatever else, and which then dramatically, that's what I mean. It kind of like widens the scope of how you conceptualize hiding through, because it's not about perception as much as it is, manipulating the social constraints on your adversary in order to act in a particular way in a particular place, right? Because in an operational sense, tactics and everything, we're seeing a lot of warfare evolving into that way. And then I was thinking a little bit tied to some of the observations and some of the questions, and also a little bit to our conversation last night. The flip side of that coin is on the offensive side, and some of the stuff that we're talking about, whatever this hybrid warfare thing is the way in which certain people are now starting to discuss and theorize then even aggressive actions, which are maybe potentially difficult to be seen because we're not conceptualizing these types of actions as warfare. Because we're used to thinking of military and kinetic operations, we're not thinking about, the weaponization of different types of things, whatever else. So I mean, that throws you completely out of the scope of your lecture and your book, maybe. But it has been tied to some of the things that you've been discussing in terms of the implications of this trajectory. And so the question is, what do you think of that?
Yeah, no, but these are all very good questions, Well, I think with regard to the first aspect, where you're talking about human shields or using, the cover of public buildings and so on, civilian infrastructure. I mean, the way I would come to that, relating it back to my broader points, is what we're talking about here is really asymmetry. And what happens when a particular military actor becomes so dominant in one sphere. So the US has pursued for the last 30, 40 years a move towards precision-guided warfare, where, again, the model is the model of global strike. We can see anything in the world, we just target it, and that's going to either have a deterrent effect or it will neutralize the threat. What I think perhaps the US hasn't thought about enough is the assumption that, well, their adversary will just play by that rule book. And that everyone, in other words, the first Gulf War, I think, was, in a way, a very misleading picture of the future. The US said, Iraq fought a conventional industrial war, and it was totally destroyed. But everyone paid attention to that. and no one has been fighting the US like this anymore, that particular game is the one that the US will win practically every single time. And so every adversary that is thinking straight is thinking, well, we're going to do something else. State militaries pursuing, hybrid techniques or forms of interstate competition that below the threshold of war, or in the space of war, non-state actors who are quite willing to breach established norms of war, particularly when they know that these norms of war can have a strategic advantage. So if the model of US warfare is let's have clean war, minimize civilian casualties, let's make war as riskless as possible, well, if you're an asymmetric adversary, you think let's make war as dirty as possible, because we know that's what the Americans don't want. So every kind of dominance in the military domain is going to produce some response, and the more radical responses are going to shift what we even understand to be war. And so, to some extent, the US has kind of produced indirectly the response to it. That its dominance in one domain is generating responses that are giving a different kind of meaning to war, or challenge simply even our conception of what war is. So I think that's a fundamental feature, I think, of war that we should expect to continue.
Yes, please.
Just a small question concerning what you said last. Given that development, could you comment on potential dilemmas of surveillance challenges domestically?
Domestically?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think one of the concerns here that I was trying to articulate at the end of the lecture is much of these technologies have been developed in the context of war to fight enemy states. But as the boundaries between the domestic and the international erode, as enemies conceal themselves within enemy societies, as the battlefield effectively disintegrates, we can no longer identify space and time of war, then the boundaries between civilian and military, I think, also erode. And therefore, some of the techniques of surveillance of the military are likely to resurface in the civilian sphere. I mean, it's happened in the past, it's not new, but I think with a new intensity. A few years ago, there was a debate, controversy in the US because initially one of the members of the White House, the Obama White House, was hesitant to rule out the possibility of a drone strike on US territory. And in the end, they said, well, no, it wouldn't be legal, but exceptionally, who knows? In other words, we want to keep our options open. And I don't think it stretches the boundaries of imagination to think that this is a quite distinct possibility in the next few decades, that a weapon system that was originally deployed as a weapon of war in foreign territories will come back to roost in domestic contexts. So I think this is one of the concerns that we should have, is that we've developed a very powerful military apparatus for perception and targeting, but if the enemy is increasingly one that's going to radically conceal themselves, then we should probably expect those techniques to be increasingly turned on domestic societies as well. And that, I think, of course, is a major issue of concern.
I'd like to ask you a question. I mean, it goes back to the kind of the concealment, because there's this notion that if you can see it, you can kill it. But the question is how, I mean, and to me, I think, how do you actually know what you're looking for? And that's a question that I guess maybe comes prior to the kind of the perceptual technologies. And in that sense, it goes back even to kind of the concealment again, because I mean, if you have all these tools to see things, and then there will be millions of ways to conceal yourself. I mean, you can decoy, digital decoys, you can poison data sets, you can do all these things. So in that sense, I'm totally agree with you that, the military not like to have a fully autonomous weapon systems going around. But then on the other hand, I also agree with you that they haven't thought out, you know, in what sense they're autonomous and in what sense they are actually in control of of the tools they're using. And I think especially in the way that they use the OODA loop, the orient the loop. But I mean, in all those senses, I mean, they're so embedded in the technologies that it becomes difficult to even understand at what point they are making their own decisions.
Yep. So I think there was a question at the beginning of
Yeah,
your
yeah,
answer,
yeah.
which is to do with which I think I take it to mean as how do you is interpretation of perception, right? So of course the account that I'm giving is a sense, a kind of mechanical account of how you can, you know, on the basis of seeing something, you can target it. That doesn't account, admittedly, on understanding the meaning of what you're seeing and whether targeting it is the right tactical, strategic thing to do. And of course, in the domain of concealment, then you get into a whole raft of questions of psychology, which is where intelligence and deception and counterintelligence comes in. Questions that are relevant to, say, hybrid warfare or things of that nature. That's something I bracketed out of the book because it opens up a whole can of worms that I think is just completely unwieldy for the purpose of the book, but is obviously very, very important. And I think it's important to note that when the capability to strike something is not de facto a reason to do so. You need to think about what the effects of that strike might be, and you do have to contend. You do have to continuously interpret what you're seeing, and be wary, of course, of all the various attempts that might exist to mislead you, to make you think that you're seeing something that you're not, and vice versa. So the challenge in that respect are obviously considerable, but I think they open a whole set of questions about psychology and interpretation, which are not directly germane to my study, but are obviously ones that we need to consider.
Questions here? Yeah.
One last observation. I'm curious if you see the categories that you've created and used as a template to describe, you know, the trajectory of targeting and perception. Have you nailed it with these 4 categories? The aiming,
Sensing, the imaging.
all of these things. I mean, is that it? Is this timeless, universal? Have you got it? Will there be future?
People reading my book in 1,000 years?
Will there be?
Well, I hope so.
Are there perhaps as yet, you know, like unarticulated a 5th category that we might like discover in the future? Or is this pretty much like this is it, and you've got it? That's kind of like one question. And then the other one is in terms of teleology, I suppose. Like, was it a foregone conclusion that once we started like throwing rocks at our brothers when we were 5, and we're trying to aim and whatnot, like that as we become more technologically sophisticated, that like it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to do these things, and we're going to continue on these things. So yeah, first one.
Two small questions.
Yeah, like are we working with platonic ideal types? And secondly, are we doomed teleologically to continue to perfect these things until we're all dead or whatever? Thanks.
Well, on the first point, it took that's what I got anyway. You know, if I'm open certainly to hear more suggestions into other categories that are missing from the analysis. It took me several years of working through the material for it to kind of take that shape. So that's probably as good as it's going to get from me anyway. But as I say, knowledge is always a work in progress. But I don't think, I wouldn't give them platonic status. They're just effectively useful categories to think of. But also crucially, you know, as I point out in the book, these concepts continually overlap and bleed into one another. They don't stand alone. They articulate themselves into what we would think of as perception. And to give an example, if you think about the human visual system, well, your eyes are sensing, producing an image that's reflected on on your eyeball and then into your brain, and your eyesight or your visual system also makes visual or spatial inferences. It's able to determine whether objects are close or near, gives you a broad sense of the relative sizes and distances of objects. So all of these are, you can functionally distinguish between them, but ultimately they're all articulated into single systems. The second point, well, I think there's a. So I would reject the notion that there's a kind of teleology, either a military or a technological teleology here at play. It seems to me that there's been, there's a certain amount of contingency here. While I trace these technologies back to the Renaissance, ultimately I think that the First World War and the 20th century have been a massive accelerating force, by which the military aspect of these technologies has become perhaps primary, and I don't think there's a teleology in the century of war that we had in the 20th century. We could have other histories could have happened and are still available. So these technologies of perception, location, and so on have all sorts of peaceful applications and powerful peaceful applications. And think about all the things that you can do with GPS or mapping that have very productive social effects. So I don't think it's a given that these technologies have to be military, but de facto that's the world we live in, and that we have to contend with. So no teleology, but and therefore we have some agency, and the point about thinking about these things is potentially to try and do something about it.
We have a last question here.
I understand that modern weapons include nuclear technologies, of course, but there is also a movement against, supporting nuclear disarmament in many countries. Do you see that nuclear weapons will cease to exist at some point in the future? I mean, taking into consideration the development of the modern technologies and drones and everything, and how to battle also biological weapons, if possible, in any future?
Well, again, small questions, but again, I don't want to embrace any kind of fatalism, but it seems unlikely that nuclear weapons are going to disappear tomorrow. And maybe a not very positive thought about these is that, well, in some ways, nuclear weapons have prevented us from perhaps having major wars just out of sheer self-preservation. So in that sense, they may have had a positive effect. The concern, of course, is that as time passes, the likelihood of a nuclear weapon being used probably increases, just statistically, whether by error or miscalculation. But there's no sign of major states wanting to abandon those weapons, and I think we probably would have to tackle at the root the causes of international conflict and war before we can even contemplate ending nuclear weapons. Some people may have more optimistic view on that, but I think there's some major structural forces that I think are the ones that we have to tackle first.
All right, on that note, we'll wrap it up here. For those of you who want to discuss Antoine's paper in a theory seminar, we'll relocate to another room called Kvartal, just around the corner here. I want to thank everyone for showing up, and especially Antoine for coming all the way from London.
Thank you.
So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And the book is for sale, 200 kroners. I recommend it. It's a great read. So if you have, please